Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dhar.
Brave New World is supported by the Center for Data Science, or CDS, at NYU. If your organization is interested in engaging with CDS through student projects, please email cdsindustry@nyu.edu. For more color on the podcast and additional commentary, please subscribe to our newsletter at vasantdhar.substack.com. Hello, and welcome to Brave New World. My guest today is me. The host for today's show is Joel Roberts, who is a former primetime talk show host at KABC Radio, Los Angeles. I met Joel through a friend and shared my forthcoming book with him. Joel told me that he was very AI-averse prior to reading my book, so I was curious to find out how it changed his thinking. I usually prepare for conversations, but this one will be completely spontaneous, and it's a dialogue. Take it away, Joel.
So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Brave New World. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be and whenever it happens to be in the world. It is my distinct pleasure to spend time with my good friend, Vasant Dhar. And just so you'll know, I am Joel Roberts. You may have heard formerly of KABC Talk Radio Los Angeles, and we are here to talk about Vasant's book, which has changed my life. For reasons that I will explain. The book is called Thinking with Machines. Vasant, welcome to your own show.
It's a pleasure to be here, Joel. As weird as it seems to be a guest on my own show, this is amazing. And thank you so much for doing it. Thank you so much for hosting this episode.
I would like to confront you with a difficult question, and I would like to start by telling you a story. And before you answer my question, I want to give you total permission to disagree with me and find me at fault for what I'm about to tell you. Fair enough?
Yeah, sounds ominous, but fair.
So, as it happens, we have a 17-year-old daughter. She just started her senior year in high school. And at the end of her junior year last year, she wrote a final paper for her English class on the American writer Cormac McCarthy and his book Blood Meridian. She ended up getting the highest score available on that paper, which totally thrilled us. But I will tell you something that thrilled me even more. What I was proudest of in this case is that she did not use chat to write one word of that 10-page paper. Of that, I am indescribably proud. My question to you is, should I be?
Absolutely, you should be proud, because increasingly people are turning to AI to make life easy for them, and that's completely understandable. They want to do a better job. They want to do as good a job as they can, and so they will run things past the AI, just to get ideas, to frame the issues they're thinking about, and many of them will then ask ChatGPT to write it for them. I've been grading these now for a few years because my students use ChatGPT, sometimes more so than I would like them to, and I advise them to avoid using it except for the essential things. So, but coming back to your daughter, she should be proud, and you should be proud, right? That this was 100% human effort, right? And she probably beat people who were using the AI.
I know, but don't you stand for literacy when it comes to AI? Facility when it comes to...
Great. So let me just say one more thing that I forgot to mention, which is that people like your daughter are in really good shape to prosper in the era of AI. Because if she can do an amazing job without it, then with it, she will only be better. She's using her mental muscle. One of the messages in my book, which I'm sure we will talk about at some point, is that the more capable you are, the more AI will amplify your abilities.
Fine. Nevertheless, I am ambivalent. And as I read your book, and by the way, reading your book was a pure pleasure. Ladies and gentlemen, forgive me for being biased, but I'm biased. Get Vasant's book, for God's sake. I've read a lot on AI by now, but I want to tell you that I came up with a simple way of describing to myself my own ambivalence about AI. Ready?
Go for it.
My ambivalence is proportional to AI's autonomy. My ambivalence is proportional to AI's agency. I am concerned about who controls whom. And I realized as I was looking at my own ambivalence, I'm terrified of, well, Jeff Hinton, the luminary in the field, put it as what is going to happen if we are controlled by a species who is more intelligent than we are. So my ambivalence is proportional to AI's autonomy. What do you have to say about that?
Well, you should be ambivalent and you should be concerned because humanity has created a machine for the first time without an explicit purpose. Every machine we've created before this has been designed for a purpose. AI, the machines that you see around us, are the first that were designed to be intelligent for the sake of being intelligent, right? So that's what they're designed to do. And if that's what they're designed to do, and if we succeed, and it seems like we are succeeding, we're a long ways, by the way, from sort of human level intelligence still in many areas. It's good to be concerned because here's a machine that is going to get smarter, and really there's no stopping it. And we've gone down the road somewhat recklessly where we're so amazed and excited by its capability, which will do wonderful things for us and improve our lives in many ways, that we've sort of, swept this problem under the rug. And what you're really getting at is the control problem, essentially. When machines get agency, they get better at what they do.
Scares the hell out. They no longer need us.
Well, they don't no longer need us. They can create goals, sub-goals for themselves to solve larger objectives that we give them. And we have no idea what they're doing under the hood.
In fact, I remember there's this paperclip scenario you may have heard of.
Yes.
Where AI is given the task of creating as many paperclips as possible. That's its primary task. But it establishes a sub-goal for itself by using human flesh to create these paperclips. And those sub-goals we may not have established at all. We have nothing to do with, but they could be very dangerous to us. And I'm a little bit comforted by the fact that you recognize that danger.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are several dangers lurking around the corner that we should be cognizant of and try and address. And that is certainly one of them, that there is this capability that is getting better and better, and we're giving machines agency. There's a lot of excitement these days around agents, machines that can actually do something for us, such as sort our emails, schedule all appointments, but there's a lot more they can do, right? As they get, more sophisticated, we'll start telling them to do more and more things for us. What's the boundary where we say enough?
I don't know. I'll tell you something. I cannot help but recall a moment when I was in 4th or 5th grade when my father, who was a rocket scientist, by the way, brought me a Texas Instruments calculator. It could add, subtract, multiply, and divide, and it may have had one other row at the top with so-called function keys, maybe a percentage key or something like that. But the calculator only did what I asked it to do. It had no agency. It had no initiative. It's not like it went off and had nocturnal escapades of numeric sex with other calculators. It didn't do that. It only did what I asked it to do. It really couldn't think. And now you have written a book that says, we think with machines. Are you saying that both of us are thinking? Do machines think like humans think?
Well, we know they don't think like humans think, right? Even though we're trying to design them, in a way that's motivated by how we think the brain works, they don't think like we do. They're embodied in silicon. We still don't understand their sort of inner workings. So we'd be hard pressed to say that they think like us, right? Every indication is that they don't think like us, even though they may appear to think like us. It would be a real stretch to say that they think like us. And by the way, more to your previous question, right? Imagine if, so we've given the machine an objective like, make sure we don't destroy the planet or some such, laudable goal. We don't know what it's going to do. Like, what does it think about humans, right? Based on everything it's read about us, I wonder, right? If you ask the AI, like, and if it were to tell us the unbridled truth, as opposed to, what we tell it is socially acceptable, like if we didn't give it this feedback that humans give it, that keep telling it, no, you can't say that. That's racist. That's sexist. That's insulting a religion or something like that, right? So we've sort of put this prophylactic around it to restrain how it process information. But if we didn't, what would it think about us, right? What would it think about billions of people who at the same time value science and the scientific method and evidence-based reasoning and thinking and all that kind of stuff, and yet believe in this entity called God without a shred of evidence whatsoever, right? I mean, it's like, what sense would that make to a rational machine, right? That looks at this species and says, what the hell are these people about, right? They are so amazing at what they've accomplished using the scientific method, and yet they've conjured up this fictitious character that they call God without any shred of evidence about its existence. So contrary and messed up.
And yet, if I look at the title of your book, Thinking with Machines, well, let me put you on the spot and then I'll give you my answer to the question. Of those three words, thinking with machines, which do you think is the most important word?
I know that's a trick question, so the answer must be with.
In other words, some sort of relationship between us is inevitable. But you said something a moment ago which brings a thought to my mind. You were talking about racist language or a sexist language. I'm sure you are aware that within the field of artificial intelligence, there is a major linguistic debate going on. In other words, how do we even refer to this? Yuval Harari, the famous world historian, does not like artificial intelligence as a term. He calls it alien intelligence. Geoffrey Hinton, godfather of AI, says, well, it is as if an alien landed on Earth and happens to speak English really, really well. There's a guy at Vanderbilt named Jules White, you may have heard of, who says he prefers the term augmented intelligence. And it's interesting to me because Yuval Harari, who regards these as alien beings and as entities of a kind, still uses anthropomorphic terms to describe these machines. So, Vasant, do we need a completely new language here?
It's interesting you asked me this question because my most recent guest, Ben Shneiderman, admonished me for using such terms to describe machines. So he says when you use words like they know something or they understand something or they're intelligent, well, no, they're not. They're machines. They don't know anything. They don't understand anything. They're not intelligent at all. And so we need a new language. And I can see exactly where he's coming from, where he wants to reserve. So this community that he's representing would like to reserve these words for humans. But that's a bit of a tall order, because then you're really sort of trying to establish a religion. You're becoming religious about this. You're saying, well, no, intelligence is inherently human, right? So you're sort of elevating humans to this, special status and saying, well, machines can't be there because they're machines and we created them. And this reminds me, and my latest newsletter had this, we were talking about Jeff Hinton, but there was a quote by Steven Pinker from one of his early books called How the Mind Works, where he talks about this as the meat-oriented view of intelligence, that intelligence means that it must be meat, and he conjures up this thought experiment where he says, imagine an advanced alien civilization that lands on Earth. The expedition leader radios back to home base and he tells the chief, he says, hey, we've encountered a really intelligent species and they've built all kinds of things. They obviously have discovered the laws of nature and, science, and they've done amazing things, but they are biological. And the chief says, really? Are you sure they just don't go through some intermediate larval state? And he says, no, they're like meat all the way through. And the chief, in disbelief says, what? Sentient meat?
But wait a minute. When you say sentient, as in they feel things, they're conscious, you've even gone so far as to wonder whether AIs, and it's interesting that they're referred to as entities, you even have gone so far as to wonder whether they will have rights. So aren't you the one who's ascribing sentience to machines?
Not yet. I'm not ascribing sentience to machines yet. I'm not even ascribing consciousness to machines yet. But I am ascribing intelligence to machines, which to me is a lower bar than consciousness and sentience. So, but the point of the story is that this silicon-based life form, which by the way, I neglected to mention, it's a silicon-based life form, is talking about sentient meat, right? So they obviously consider themselves sentient and are amazed that there's, biology here that seems to be sentient. So I'm not saying AI is sentient. Could it become sentient? It could. It's, it certainly is within the realm of possibility if you're willing to believe that it doesn't require biology. Another podcast guest of mine, Anil, neuroscientist and a cognitive scientist and a philosopher, regards consciousness as arising from all of these things that the brain is doing subconsciously, interestingly, right? That it's keeping track of the body and keeping the body in equilibrium. And that somehow is, an essential ingredient of consciousness, right? So his position is, yes, you do need biology for consciousness. And I'm willing to buy that. I just don't think that you need biology for intelligence.
It's interesting. You had a guest on one of your podcasts. Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing his name. Anil Seth?
Yes, that's who I was talking about, Anil Seth.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, right. You called him Seth. I said Seth. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Anil Seth.
But he studies consciousness. And he said a very interesting thing about anesthesia. That anesthesia, which knocks us out, so to speak, may not knock the entire brain out. It knocks portions of the brain out, or it prevents them from talking to each other.
Right.
But they're not all completely defunct for the moment. And it really raises an interesting question about the geography of human brains and the geography of an AI brain. A human brain, I gather, works from what are called neural networks, even deep neural networks. I've heard similar things about AI brains. Do you agree when you compare human brains to AI brains, is this a difference of degree or in kind?
Ooh, that's a great question and a deep one. The artificial neural networks that underpin modern AI are motivated by the architecture of the brain. I mean, we've sort of looked inside. Well, I shouldn't say architecture, but they're motivated by what we've learned about how the brain seems to be organized, right? And it's organized in terms of these things called neurons and synapses, and that's ultimately, what we have in our head, and that's what ultimately enables us to achieve some amazing capabilities. The artificial neural net that you see in AI is motivated by that. Does that make it the same? No, it's completely different, right? The way it learns is probably completely different. In AI, the core learning algorithm is called backprop. Essentially the way it works is it takes an input, predicts an output, and then some supervisor says, no, that's incorrect. The answer is not 85, it's 42. And the machine says, I need to tamp things down. And so it propagates that feedback backwards so that the next time it sees the same input, it'll get it right, or it'll be much closer to the answer. Is that how we learn? I don't think so. But when I say I don't think so, I don't think we learn like backprop, exactly. So the algorithm that we use for learning is something that we don't really understand completely, right? We've approximated it in this algorithm called backprop, but we'd be hard-pressed to say that it works anything like our brain works, despite having a similarly motivated kind of structure, this very heavily interconnected structure where these neurons are connected by synapses. And by the way, the complexity of these new AI machines in terms of the number of neurons and number of synapses is now approaching the complexity of our brain, right? So that's how complex these new AI machines have become, right? So they sort of almost rival us, in terms of sort of the sheer complexity. And chances are they'll get even bigger and they'll get more complex.
Oh, my God. They're building data centers now that will make mincemeat of our little brains, won't they?
That is certainly possible. I wouldn't have chosen mincemeat, but yeah, they.
You're the one who brought up meat.
They'll do something. They'll do a lot of things for us. Some of them will be pretty amazing, and sometimes they'll turn some of us into mincemeat.
One thing I learned from reading your book and listening to your podcasts is these things are beginning to perceive on their own. They can read X-rays on their own. They can certainly peruse literature on their own. I even learned from you, one of your guests, forgive me, I don't recall his name, that they can smell and they can detect smells. I actually have a sort of a subversive question for you. In addition to detecting smells, can these things emit smells? Are we looking at a future where there will be, I don't know how else to put it, olfactory 3D printers?
Oh, sure thing. I mean, they're already here. So one of my recent guests, Alex Wiltschko, talks about this, right? He wants to bring smell to the masses. And this is an area in which I've been engaged for myself for the last few years with, one of my colleagues at the medical school and one of my PhD students at the Center for Data Science. I've gotten into smell quite deeply myself over the last 3 years. In my conversation with Alex, he pointed out that, maybe people will want their own sort of smell logos, just like we have logos, right? So imagine if you're an artist or a rock star, whatever, or just a regular person, right? You just want to have your smell signature. Can you produce it? Well, we're at the, point now where you can. In fact, during our conversation, Alex said, describe to me what you'd like to, the computer to produce. And I said, well, how about Provence in the spring? And he says, what time of day? I said, how about early mornings? All right, wrote it down. So you'll get it in the mail at home. I still haven't gotten the mail, which reminds me, I need to remind Alex. But that was the whole point, that I described what I was thinking and I wanted, and he could send it to me. Now, in the future, chances are this could happen, in real time.
Wait a second. What exactly would he send to you? Like a liquid, something like a cologne?
Yeah, he sent me a vial with exactly what I wanted, and the computer would have created it for me.
So these things can not only detect smells. There's a woman that you write about in your book that can detect Parkinson's disease.
That's right, Joy Milne. And she didn't know she had this ability until, she got married when she was 19, her husband was 21, and she noticed when he turned 32 that suddenly his smell changed, and he became irritable and just started behaving really strangely. She had detected the same smell on his mother years earlier. She was institutionalized for depression and also diagnosed with Parkinson's. She only realized that she could smell Parkinson's when she and her husband went to a meeting of a support group of people with Parkinson's, and she said she smelled it on everyone. And that's when she realized that she had the ability to smell it. And subsequently, they did a test where they took, I forget, maybe 24 or a dozen T-shirts that had been worn by people with Parkinson's and without. And she got only one wrong, one false positive. And that person developed Parkinson's the following year. So
unbelievable. But again, even more unbelievable to me is that these machines not only can detect smells, but can emit them, can produce them. Am I correct?
Yeah. I mean, the producing part, by the way, is, once you have the concept of what smell you're trying to create, like whether it's, fruity or cheesy or whatever you want, right? So once you've managed to describe it in a way that the computer, quote unquote, understands, then for the computer to produce it is relatively easy. It has to know which, molecules to mix in what proportions to produce it.
All right. Speaking of these machines producing things relatively easy with or without our prompting, which again is something that scares me. I think that much of our discussion here has to center around a couple of different questions. What are the risks? What are the benefits? In pondering the risks, how should we approach that? Do we have the moral equipment, let alone the international consensus, which I'll come to in due course, to deal with these technological advances? Can a less intelligent species control a more intelligent one? So there's a lot for us to get into. But if I may, I'd like to ask you to start with AI's remarkable capabilities. For example, I had no idea these bloody machines could smell. I just didn't know that till I read your book. Okay, I knew they could read novels and summarize them in however many words you wanted. I did not know they could detect smells. If you would, please, in the fields of, let's say, medicine, finance, whatever, talk to me about some of what we should celebrate in AI, the capabilities.
So do you want to start with the celebration, or do you want to start with the risks? Because you started your question with, talking about the risks. So where should we start, Joel?
You're a perceptive man, because I felt obligated intellectually to begin with the capabilities. But in fact, if you were to monitor my heart right now and what causes it to beat faster, I'm more concerned about the risks. So can we talk about the risks?
Yeah, so let's talk about the risks, because the capabilities are going to be pretty amazing, and we can assume that these capabilities will get better over time, right? And lots of people have described the kinds of things we might see in this brave new world that's emerging. There's several ways to look at the risks, but fundamentally, one of the questions that we confront is, how do we really develop a calculus that balances things like individual freedom and liberty versus sort of collective consequences on society, right? And that's always been a balance in society and democracy, where citizens have sort of both obligations and rights, and so you can't yell fire in the crowded theater, that's against the law. So I said we need a calculus, right? What does that mean? I'll give you a personal example. Last year, April 15th, I had a near-death experience. I thought for sure I was going to die on the Sawmill Parkway heading into New York City.
And I am obliged to ask, since it was on April 15th, this near-death experience had nothing to do with your taxes?
Nothing to do with my taxes. I mean, I did owe some money, but not enough to
give you a near-death experience.
Exactly, right? So, I can laugh about it now, but in that instant where it happened, right, I was, cruising at 50, 55 miles an hour through on the Sawmill Parkway. There's a set of lights there. And suddenly, 15 feet ahead of me, like a car length or two, I see a gray SUV right across my path, just like a T. And I calculated later that it took me a sixth of a second from recognizing I was going to die to impact. And I'll never forget that, just like a collision at 50, 55 miles an hour, my windscreen turned opaque white. The car continued to lurch forward and miraculously stopped on the right side of the road. The other driver completely unharmed, her vehicle sort of spun around, and ended up facing the same way, I think. But my best guess is she didn't see me coming, right? When this happened, I walked up to her. She must have been in her late 70s. My guess is that, her eyesight isn't great, and she just didn't see me coming. Now, here's a question. And, people talk about the fact that, driverless cars make errors, right? And the way I see it is AI will invariably make errors, right? So we're living with machines that are pretty amazing, but they will make mistakes. We give humans a lot of latitude when it comes to mistakes because, to err is human, right? It's always been that way. People will make mistakes. We accept that. But we're much less willing to accept the machine making mistakes. And that's good, right? We should hold machines to a much higher standard. But perfection, that just seems infeasible, right? We cannot expect that machines will never make a mistake. Not these modern machines. Maybe machines that do billing or, bank statements and things like that. Well, those should never, ever, ever make mistakes. But the kinds of, machines we're seeing around us that make decisions about all kinds of things like driving or business decisions or legal decisions, if we have machines making decisions, they're going to make mistakes. And by the way, this is one of the things that someone like Ben Shneiderman would say, see, I told you that we're giving machines too much agency. We should just treat them as tools and keep them in the closet, right? And that way we won't get into trouble. But I think the horse has left the barn, right? We can't really sort of inhibit or curtail these machines to stay in the closet. They're out. They're and soon they're going to be wandering around. They're going to be mobile, and they're going to be sort of watching the world, learning by interacting with the physical world, just like humans do. But to come back to near-death experience, right? The question is, would I have been better off if the lady with a driverless car? Absolutely. I don't think a driverless car would make that kind of mistake. I had a guest on my podcast, Missy Cummings, a former F-18 U.S. Navy fighter pilot, and she talked about how AI doesn't have situational awareness of the sort that humans do. And she's absolutely right? We have this sort of sixth sense almost, like the situational awareness that goes beyond what we're looking at, right? We sort of have a gestalt of some sort and put things together. Machines don't have that. But humans lose situational awareness all the time. The old lady did for sure. And more than we realize, right? So one of the big questions here is, what is the calculus? How do we evaluate machine error in the aggregate versus human error? And how do we make that trade-off?
I recall watching your TEDx talk. At least you may have given more than one, but this was at Hamilton College, I think, in New York, if I'm correct.
Yes, in 2018.
Yeah. And you had something that, frankly, I had not seen before quite that way, but it was, I think you called it a heat map.
I did.
Obviously, the audience can't see us here, but can you kind of describe what the heat map is? Because it is a way of weighing risks against benefits and seeing where something kind of lands, is it not?
Yeah, it is. And it's really simple to visualize, right? So you can conjure it up relatively easily, right? So it has these two axes. One of them is predictability, which goes from 0 to 1, right? 0 means no better than random. 1 means you never make a mistake in prediction. Like, will the sun rise tomorrow? Yes, it will. 100%, right?
And that's the bottom axis, the horizontal one.
That's the horizontal axis of predictability, which goes from 0 to 1, right? So, and the vertical axis is the cost of error. So the horizontal axis measures how often do you make mistakes. The vertical axis says, what are the consequences of those mistakes? So if you are on the extreme right on predictability, you never make any mistakes, then you should trust the machine, right? Because, hey, it never makes any mistakes, except if it occasionally makes mistakes and those mistakes are catastrophic, right? Then you've got to think twice. You say, well, yeah, okay, it never makes it rarely makes mistakes, but when it does, it's catastrophic. It's like having a machine that monitors the Earth, but every once in a while it blows up the Earth. Well, that's not acceptable, So you would never want to have a machine in control over something that important where the consequences are so high.
Driverless cars that are perfectly safe 99% of the time, but that kill 1 5-year-old per month, we're probably not going to manufacture them. Is that, in effect, what you're saying?
I mean, if it killed an innocent 5-year-old on the street every month, we would be concerned. Much more concerned than if it killed its driver in full-on autonomous mode every month, since the driver made the decision to trust the car. Taking innocent people's lives would be an unacceptably high cost of error.
Okay, so we're now in the realm of trust, and still in the category of fears that I have about this. I want to bring up some things to you, and then I want to raise a fear that I have not heard sufficiently addressed. I remember watching Geoffrey Hinton. Again, for those of you who don't know, he's considered the godfather of AI, worked at Google for a number of years, British guy. He said his main 2 fears are A, that AI will fall into the hands of bad actors, a fear which I share, and B, the little issue of it'll just plain take over humanity. Okay, fine. I have 2 fears that I don't think get quite enough attention. The first is what I would call the tyranny of the machines. In other words, not just in AI, but in general. I think machines may be making us stupider because we don't have to independently think as much. To give you a very quick example, and then I actually am going to move on to a different one. I showed up at a medical office recently, 2 days in a row. It was a complete coincidence. A couple of years ago, I broke 2 bones in my foot. I had developed a knee problem as a result, so I had a foot doctor and a knee doctor, okay? So I show up for the foot appointment on a Wednesday, and I fill out everything on the tablet and all that kind of stuff. And then I show up for the next appointment the following day, literally 23 hours later. And they say to me, "Here's the tablet, please fill it out again." And I said, "I filled it out yesterday." And she said, "Well, it's a different appointment. You need to fill it out again." And then, to her utter astonishment, I uttered one word, which it was almost as if she had never heard it in her entire life. I said, "No." And she said, "Listen, Mr. Roberts, I can't admit you back into the clinical area until you have filled out this form again, and then it will automatically trigger your admission back into the clinical area." And I said, "I have an idea. There are people back in the clinical area, right?" And she said, "Yes, dozens of them." And I said, "And there are telephones back there, right?" And she said, "Dozens of them." I said, "Kindly pick up the phone and let them know I'm here and that my date of birth and my residence have not changed since 23 hours ago." This is what I mean by making us stupider and the tyranny of the machine. But there is actually something deeper that I really want to get your take on, and it troubles me. It troubles me in part because I grew up the son of a rocket scientist, and I have seen this mentality. So Geoffrey Hinton can talk about bad actors. He can talk about AI taking over humanity. There's something else that scares me, and I'm going to call it, Vasant, I'm going to call it the mentality of we climb the mountain because it is there. Now, you, coming from Kashmir, know that not that far away from Kashmir is a rather famous tall mountain in another country called Nepal, which I'm sure you can name. Now, Sir Edmund Hillary and his Sherpa companion, Tenzing Norgay, in 1953, summited, this is the first time that we know about Mount Everest. And a fascinating thing is the quote, "I climbed the mountain because it is there," is actually misattributed to Sir Edmund Hillary. I don't know if you knew that.
I didn't, actually.
The person who really said it was George Lee Mallory, not in 1953, but in 1924.
And Mallory actually died, right?
Mallory died. Yeah. You're right.
Yep, I do remember that.
He and his partner died.
Yeah.
But he's the one who said, I climbed the mountain because it is there. I'm actually going to give you a 3-part question here. It's a 3-part story that leads the question. So this notion of being so enticed and seduced by a challenge that all other considerations are secondary is what I interpret climbing the mountain because it is there to mean. Now let's switch scenes to Los Alamos, New Mexico. And I'm sure you know where I'm going. And for those of our listeners who've seen the movie Oppenheimer, they know that I think it was one day in July when they tested the first atomic device. They were 5 miles away. They were in pits. They were wearing protective glasses. Literally, Oppenheimer said to General Grove, this whole thing, this could ignite the entire atmosphere and possibly burn up the planet. Meanwhile, the countdown continued. And it is not that the atomic scientists were not aware of the moral issues raised by the bomb. It is that splitting the atom and controlling the reaction was such an enticing scientific problem to them that they just couldn't pass. They climbed the mountain because it was there. Oppenheimer, look, you may no longer be a Hindu. I gather you were born Hindu but are not currently religious. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm not religious, but I'm still Hindu. I mean, I was born that, and I'm perfectly happy with that.
All right. So Oppenheimer quoted a line from the Gita when the device exploded. I am now become death, destroyer of worlds. And that's what Oppenheimer said at the time. And he said, there were people who cheered when the explosion went off, and there were people who cried. There were people who were traumatized, and there were people who were inspired. There were people who wondered what the implications of this would be, and we really had no way of knowing. But the one thing we can certainly state from this is whatever moral qualms they had were secondary to the compulsion of cracking the code. Now I come to AI. And I say, I'm seeing a similar dynamic. Yes, companies want money and people are motivated by that. Yes, countries want power and people are motivated by that. But Vasant, it's the curiosity that scares the hell out of me. Engineers want to crack the code. I will go so far as to say, and if you disagree, fine, that amorality scares me as much as immorality, and curiosity scares me as much as malice. People want to climb the mountain because it's there, and the implications they don't always think through. Your thoughts?
Wow. I love the way you framed the situation. My mother used to caution me, curiosity kills the cat, because I was such a nuisance with my endless barrage of questions. Scientists want to solve hard problems, and it's no different with AI. Most scientists working at AI companies are creating irresistible products. I mean, cracking problems at the frontier of intelligence is what it's all about. They're not thinking about the moral consequences of it. That's someone else's problem. And the technology is different. We're not splitting the atom. But we're creating something that's, again, potentially dangerous. Now,
it's worse, and I'll tell you why. Atom bombs can't drop themselves.
Well, yes, they can't. Exactly, they can't drop themselves. But, the interesting thing is that atomic energy, again, is a double-edged sword, for example. Like splitting the atom is a double-edged sword. We could harness atomic energy from it, which is amazing, right? Maybe that's, the way humanity will go. Like future energy might be atomic. And that's an example of where we're keeping it contained, right? We're controlling it. And you're right. The only way it goes out of control is something like Chernobyl, right? Where you have this disaster that, ended up bringing down Gorbachev, right? That's how significant it was, right? That was Gorbachev's kind of the beginning of the end for him. And so, you can have those kinds of disasters, it's the same thing. How do you really keep that contained, right? How do you keep it from going completely rogue and destroying us? We managed to do that so far with atomic energy, with splitting the atom. But we now face that challenge with AI.
And AI, unlike splitting the atom, has become autonomous and will only become more autonomous. And that is why I am afraid of this kind of amoral dynamic of scientists saying, well, it's not our concern what people do with this. We're just so damn curious. We're going to crack this code no matter what. Consequences be damned.
But by the way, to be fair, there are plenty of scientists who are concerned. And in fact, some even wanted to put a moratorium, on AI research, and, sort of putting clamps around AI. But again, that's unrealistic, right? I mean, that genie is out of the bottle, right? There's no way you're going to convince scientists to not research, and take the field forward, right? So that's just, you can't mandate that. You can't pass laws against it. So even though their intentions are, they're well-meaning intentions, it just isn't feasible. The genie's out of the bottle and we're not putting it back in there.
Mm-hmm. And the genie may turn and flip the bird at the entire human race.
It is conceivable. It's certainly not out of the question. But more than the AI itself, rogue states or actors using it for nefarious means are especially worrisome. How do you even pass international laws around controlling something like that?
All right. Let's talk about some of the other risks associated with AI. In your TEDx talk that you showed a New Yorker cartoon that I thought was one of the funniest things I've ever seen, of a bunch of robots walking down Fifth Avenue, and one of them drops a coin in a human beggar's cup. Now that's unnerving, chilling, and hysterical. But are we headed for that? Are we engineering our own extinction, or at least relevance?
That cartoon which you refer to, which, it's hard to describe. That's one of those things where a picture is literally worth 1,000 words, isn't it?
Well, hopefully I came close.
But yeah, I mean, that's the imagery there is really quite stark. And, some would argue that, yes, that's the way it's going. The cartoon sort of caricaturizes, a bum sitting on the street with a bowl, and a robot's walking by and drops a coin in there. But that's what people mean by, universal basic income, that essentially the computer is just going to become so much better than we are at, almost everything, that it reduces most of us to, the state of that guy sitting there with a bowl, wanting a coin, and that coin is universal basic income.
That's depressing.
Indeed, it is. But it's a caricature, at the moment anyway. And what the picture is telling us is that humans need to up their game. Indeed, I see a bifurcation of humanity where some humans become super intelligent, right? They become incredibly amplified in terms of their capability because they already know so much that the AI just kind of supercharges what they already know. And I'm seeing this. A friend of mine who's a molecular biologist, told me that ChatGPT has been a godsend because he can now explore related fields without relying on a human, right? He can, get the machine to write a little program for him, feed it his data, get data from somewhere else. A few years ago, that would have required him to collaborate, let's say, with a physicist or a computer scientist or a programmer. Right now, it's just he can do the whole thing himself, right? So, so he has a question that he wants to answer, and he already has deep knowledge in his domain, in this case in molecular biology, because he's trying to answer a question on, of like, let's say, safety. Like, at what point is, a new molecularly engineered drug safe enough? For something like that, it just amplifies you. and makes you sort of superhuman. And it makes you superhuman in a way because you're asking questions that only you can ask. Well, because the machine doesn't really have curiosity yet, right? It's not trying to solve that specific problem of drug safety that you're interested in. It doesn't really have a purpose yet, right? So it is still largely a tool. And so for people like that, it becomes incredibly powerful in terms of amplifying them. On the other hand, there's the danger, and that's, characterized by, the guy sitting there with the begging bowl, which is there's nothing left for that person to do because their inherent skill level and knowledge is so low that they can't bootstrap themselves up to sort of this point of becoming sort of superhuman and amplify their capability. And that's what I see happening. And, so it's a partially depressing scenario because what it means is that a lot of people become, replaced by a machine and need to now find something else to do. Previously, we've always, people have retrained themselves and found things to do. Well, this time around, it's going to be different. But hopefully, we get over that. But there's going to be some humans that are just going to be worth so much because they can now do things that they were unable to do without the machine. And the machine by itself isn't curious enough to do them on its own.
You keep using a word that I like, which is amplify. But that can go in two different directions, can't it?
Exactly.
In other words, yes. In other words, there's the fear of AI is just going to take over everything. But there is also the fear that even if it doesn't take over everything, it is a neutral amplifier. It is an amoral amplifier. For example, I'm sure you've heard of Mustafa Suleyman. Yes?
I have, yeah.
For those of you that don't know, he's got a book called The Coming Wave. He was with Google for a number of years. I think DeepMind was one of his companies. He's sort of another well-known name in the field. And he talks about the possibility of some lone teenager in the middle of nowhere or in the middle of New York City, who knows, and who has a DNA synthesizer, which is a machine that's apparently available for not nearly as much money as it used to cost. And this kid develops a novel pathogen against which we have no defense, and 1 billion people die. There's a line in the book that I read while I was preparing for you. And it's a good line. I don't know whether he wrote it or his co-author, who's a guy named Michael Bhaskar, so I have to acknowledge him possibly. But anyway, the line is apocalypse, mail order. Apocalypse, mail order. Do you know, Vasant, whether one agrees that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in killing John Kennedy? Do you know that Oswald, who did fire the shot, there's not a lot of disagreement about that. Was he the only one? I don't know. But the gun that he used was a $12.95 mail order gun. And this 2-bit loser of a human being, Lee Harvey Oswald, who got thrown out of the military, who tried to be with the pro-Castro group and they didn't want him, then tried to sell his services as a mole to the CIA and they didn't want him. This 2-bit loser with a mail-order gun changed history. You have said that Luigi Mangione, who's the young kid that killed Brian Thompson, the CEO of United Healthcare in New York, built his own gun from a web design. Data is dangerous, man. It's amoral. And I am concerned about this neutral amplifier. I am concerned that we give too much power to those that we think are geniuses. You look at the crash of Wall Street 2007. Very, very intelligent people who nearly ruined the human race financially. Data's a dangerous thing.
It is indeed. And it doesn't need to be a disgruntled teenager who produces a pathogen. In fact, it's unlikely to be a disgruntled teenager that produces a pathogen. It's actually going to be someone who's incredibly savvy who produces it, or a government, or a rogue state, or some lab in some country that's, exploring, new ways of coming up with killer pathogens, right? I mean, that's a more likely path, that this is, that one should be concerned about is that like I said, the people that it amplifies, or the entities that it amplifies, are the ones who are already going to have like really advanced knowledge and are capable of understanding the outputs from the AI and massaging them and directing them and all that kind of stuff. This is going to come from people with knowledge and with power. I'm more concerned about humans that control the AI than the AI going rogue by itself. At the moment, in many areas of our life where AI is used for nefarious purposes, we have no laws for determining whether a crime has even been committed, let alone what to do about it. The lack of laws puts people who control the AI at a big advantage and encourages risky behavior. People also draw a parallel between AI and electricity as general-purpose technologies, meaning technologies that impact every industry. Electricity amplified our brawn, AI amplifies the brain. No one controls electricity, but AI is different. We need to think through why it's different and unique. And one of the themes in my book that I build on is the brawn versus brain distinction. One of the questions I raise is are the people who control the brain, right? Because that's where future value is going to lie, the way I see it, is it's not in more mechanical power. We've sort of been there, done that. Where it's really going is brain power, right? So, people with the brain power, with the machines that have the brain power, are the ones where, that's where value will be added in businesses, is being sort of the brains of future machines. And one of the questions is someone going to control that? Like, who's going to control the brains of these future machines? Or will that knowledge be sort of democratized somehow, right? That no one controls it. That's one of the biggest open questions facing AI, is who controls it? And by the way, no one has the answers, right? Because, there's some people who argue for open source, right? Because no one should control it. It should be open source. It should be purely, available to everyone. And there's a lot to be said for that. At the same time, people say, well, but it can be misused, right? The more easy you make it, the more open source you make the really powerful things, then it will get misused. And unfortunately, our human history is, not a very flattering one, right? That we've done terrible things to each other, over the millennia. And there's no reason to believe that, those tendencies have somehow gone away.
No, they haven't gone away. What you just said reminds me, of all things, of Facebook. Facebook discovered that outrage equaled engagement, and engagement equaled money.
Correct.
And as a result of that, their business model changed. And they began to propagate, initially, I would just say out-and-out lies, conspiracy theories, and then they started to try to control for that. And I am concerned, as you are, about who controls the brain. I'm concerned about who controls the brain of AI, and I'm concerned about who controls our brains. I'll tell you a funny story, which unfortunately lacks one key element, but very quickly, I'm a frequent consumer of YouTube video. And I have various interests, as I'm sure you do. And so YouTube's algorithm sends me all kinds of suggested viewing in that right-hand column on the page. And they all make sense. I, for example, am an avid cyclist. They send me videos about cycling. I'm extremely interested in Middle Eastern politics. They send me videos in more than one language about Middle Eastern politics. I'm now really interested in artificial intelligence, and YouTube is feeding me artificial intelligence. But one day, YouTube fed me a video in an area that I had never explored anything in. I mean, nothing. I had no interest, no conscious interest in this area. And yet, there was this suggested video, which I watched and found fascinating. And I thought, that's scary. Do they know me better than I know myself? Have they read my unconscious? Is there some sort of unseen matrix in my mind that they can view that I can't? I'm concerned about the controlling of the human mind, too.
The answer to those questions is yes, 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 and yes. It knows all kinds of things about you that you're not even aware of. And it is becoming so good at it, right? It's just getting better. And therein lies the problem, right? That there's this sort of danger that you just become a passive receiver of content and you just become a consumer, right? And you turn into a passive consumer and pretty soon you stop thinking, right? And that's the danger, right? You stop thinking, your mental muscle atrophies and everything else atrophies, right?
Thank you.
I mean, keeping that mental muscle active is one of the most important things in life. It's one of the reasons I continue to teach and enjoy it is because I'm always dealing with incredibly smart people, sometimes many times smarter than I am, who's just constantly pushing me to think. And, that's important. And the danger, one of the dangers of AI is it's so good, it becomes so good that it just turns into a passive receptacle.
I think that we are at a societal crossroads. And I think the question of, do we have the moral equipment or do we have the international consensus to deal with these advances is really, really what's up right now. And this high-tech problem brings me back to an issue which you learned about when you were a boy. So I'm going to surprise you by asking you, Vasant. You'll really think this is the ultimate non sequitur, but I enjoy non sequiturs. How did you learn to swim? In a moment, I'll reveal why I'm asking. How did you learn to swim?
I jumped into the deep end one day.
Right. But there's a little more to the story, right?
Yeah, this is like a long time ago. I was like a kid, 4 or 5 years old. We were at the swimming pool at a club in India. There weren't that many swimming pools there at the time. My dad was a good swimmer. He jumped into the deep end. He said, hey, jump in. And so I did. And I described that in one of my chapters on trust, that was just like 100% trust. He said, jump in. So I jumped in. I didn't have any reason to believe that any harm would come to me. And so I jumped in and he saw me jump in. I went to the bottom. I came up again. I went down again and he pulled me up, and, let me flail around a little bit. And he said, well, now you know how to swim. So that was my first exposure to,
And in your book, that really speaks to a certain theme. And what is that theme?
Trust.
Yes.
But verify.
Doveriai no proveriai.
That's right.
But yes, you trusted your father, didn't you?
I did.
Right. 100%, correct?
Yeah, totally. And by the way, in that chapter, I also describe another incident where I completely trusted my mother, who, my dad had been posted to Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and I was 9. And she, put me in the 7th grade instead of the 4th grade by mistake, and I just trusted that she would put me in the right grade, but didn't. So that was, a challenging period, where I was in a class, I was 9 and my, classmates were 15 and 16. And this is real, by the way, right? This is real. Like, as they say, you can't make this shit up. It's like, You know, I mean, when I tell people this story, it's just like amazing, right? That you could continue, and I carried on for the whole year as a 9-year-old, you know, among 15 and 16-year-olds, you know, and just went on, right? This used to happen in the old days. Wouldn't happen now, you know. I went to every parent-teacher conference of my kids, you know. And if you don't show up, you're a bad parent. You know, my parents never showed up at my school. Like, you know, my education was someone else's problem.
And that's why nobody raised an alarm about someone who was quite a bit shorter than everybody else being in the class.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Look, I have spent my entire life being quite a bit shorter than everybody else, so you have a little bit of sympathy. But there's a reason why I brought up this swimming thing. And there's a reason why I brought up trust. Because you, in one of your Substack articles, said you wanted to disentangle truth from trust. There were organizers of a conference about whether online platforms had completely fragmented our attention and whether a society can function without a shared reality. I'm reading your writing to you, sir. Mm-hmm. And you said these are very interesting questions which require disentangling trust from truth. I'm going to come back to that. My response, this is Vasant writing, to the larger question was that a liberal democracy can progress and thrive despite different versions of the truth. Indeed, truth is often difficult to ascertain. What makes liberal democracies work is stable, and here comes the word again, trustable institutions, a shared version of truth. Well, let me tell you something. I don't think we can disentangle trust from truth. And I'd like to hear you say more about that.
Well, you know, I could take this in a number of ways, Joel, that, you know, we've always functioned in society with different versions of the truth, you know, and sometimes truth, you know, and as I point out, sometimes truth is difficult to ascertain, you know. So if I say Joel is a singer, well, you know, maybe people need to hear you sing before they believe whether Joel is a singer. And some people may say, oh yeah, he's a great singer. And other people might say, meh. Okay? So that's an example of, you know, different sort of shades or interpretations of something. On the other hand, it's hard to function without some agreed, you know, notion of things, right? And so at some level, we do need some agreement on, you know, are we seeing red? Are we seeing green? We do want truth. What's become sort of interesting now that the current administration, for example, what I'm sensing is that they think that AI has a liberal bias, right? That it's biased. It's not, and bias means you're not being truthful. And bias is all around us, right? It distorts the truth, right? And so, you know, one of the concerns is, how do we know that these machines are telling us the truth? How do we know that AI is telling us the truth? And that's, you know, a critical question. And at the moment, the way these machines are designed is there are human beings who keep telling the machine, well, this is okay, this is not okay, not okay. And then after enough of this training, the machine, quote unquote, behaves itself. But what's it telling us? It's basically telling us kind of, it's like the least offensive response is what it's really giving you. How much that has to do with the truth is a different matter. And now we're in sort of this really dangerous territory. And I don't have the answer to this, by the way, but I'm identifying the problem. The problem is that the AI machine that we have right now, ChatGPT, is sort of quote unquote the best average response that its designers could come up with that will offend the least number of people and satisfy the most number of people, right? That's kind of what it is. And ultimately, that's what good business is about, right? And so they're looking at it from a business perspective, from a pragmatic perspective, that is, we have a machine that's sort of generally useful to most people most of the time, but every once in a while it isn't going to be. And how do who gets to say whether the machine is biased or not? People at OpenAI, right? So who gets to say that? We haven't answered that question yet. We
haven't.
Right? We've just sort of blithely gone along with whatever's being sort of given to us, and we consume it because it's so damn good, right? But we forget to ask ourselves, how did they decide that this is the best response? Who got to decide that, right? Why should OpenAI have this annoying Northern Californian sensibility, right? Why couldn't it have a Tennessee sensibility or one from Beijing or whatever, right? I mean, it could have so many different kinds of sensibilities, right? I'm sure that, and by the way, DeepSeek is very different, right? If you ask it about Tiananmen Square, it says thinking, and it says, oh shit, I'm not supposed to say bad things about it, because they're going to shut me off. I better say good things, right? I mean, this is the situation we're in, right? It's all very arbitrary and, put together by glue and strings. And that's what we have. And that is so damn good that we just sort of, blithely go along and say, yeah, well, it's just going to get better. But there's some major unresolved issues here, regarding bias and truth.
Yeah. Have you ever heard the phrase that we live in a post-truth society? Have you heard that phrase?
I have not. So tell me who came up with this.
I don't know. But it's around and about quite a bit. And I think what it means is not that there is no such thing as truth. I think the people who use the phrase post-truth society would still agree that 2 + 2 = 4. But I think what they're saying is there's really much less consensus than there was before. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who I think was a senator from either New York or Massachusetts or something. New York. Okay, forgive me. You're a New Yorker. I just offended everybody who lives in your state. I'll atone. So he was famous for saying something which in fact may have originated with John Adams. We don't know, which is you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And I remember when I was sitting in our TV room and I first heard the term post-truth society, in about a nanosecond, I muttered out loud to no one in particular, there's no such thing. And my wife, they were just going into a commercial. My wife put the TV on mute and she said, what do you mean there's no such thing as a post-truth society? I said, if it's post-truth, it's not a society. I may be wrong. Look, there are different narratives. You look at the January 6, 2021 Capitol riot, and I'm using a term there, riot. And I'm sure if you ask the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and all the people who were wearing QAnon T-shirts, they believed that Donald Trump had the election stolen from him. They really believed it. Do you know, I come from an ethnic group that paid an enormous price, an incalculable price, for a nation and others beyond the nation believing myths about us that were simply ludicrous. I mean, just completely the realm of absurdity. So when we talk about consensus, and when we talk about we're going to need some way of containing these things or controlling these things, I'm not optimistic. I think here in the United States, the separation of powers is becoming, well, less separate. Let's put it that way. And I think government agencies are being gutted or eliminated altogether. And I think candidates for public service are having to pass loyalty tests. Who gets to determine what is real, what is, I'll use the word kosher, what's legitimate? I think this is going to surprise you. Ready? Are you seated?
I am.
I think you've written a political book.
I hadn't thought of it that way, Joel, but I see what you mean. Yeah. I didn't intend to write a political book, but the governance of AI is a highly political thing.
I know. But it's a book with political implications, vast political implications. And if I may, can I embarrass you for a moment and tell you what I really appreciated about your book?
Don't hold back. Embarrass me.
Vasant, until I read your book, I had never used ChatGPT. I don't use it. But I will now. And I will now because of you. And it's not because a peculiar assignment fell into my lap. I have a lot of experience interviewing people. I was a broadcaster on KABC Radio and other stations for very nearly 6,000 hours. That's a long time.
You have that sound to you, by the way. You sound like...
That's a genetic accident. I had nothing to do with that. Absolutely nothing to do with that. But I had a prejudice, a fear, a terror. That's why I started this thing with being so proud of my daughter for not using chat. And then I read your book. And I thought, well, first of all, it's the best treatment I've read about the evolution of this technology, from one kind of learning to machine learning and deep learning and general intelligence and all that kind of stuff. That was, I halfway knew it, but barely halfway. So you made it all make sense to me, but you did something else for me. You made me comfortable with the idea of it. I'm not even sure if that was your intention, in the way that you didn't intend to write a political book. But you made me a non-scientist, much to the dismay of my rocket scientist father, who used to look at me, by the way, and say, "Son, it's a good thing you look like me, or I'd have some serious questions for your mother." But you made me more comfortable with it. And now I'm going to learn how to prompt it. I'm going to make use of it. I'm going to make sure my daughter, that I was so proud of for not using it, is able to use it. Kudos to you, my friend.
Well, Joel, you've made my day, and on that note, I'll say that, my objective was to write this for everyone, to make it accessible to everyone, and not in the dry kind of textbooky kind of way. My podcast producer told me, he said, if you write another book on AI, I'm not going to read it, but if you write your story, I will. And so I've written it as a story, and I was, one of my colleagues asked me yesterday, "Oh, what's your book about?" I said, "Well, it's a story." And he said, "That really?" I said, "Yeah, it's a story. It really is a story with serious amount of heft in it that I tried to sort of put in sort of along the way as I tell the story." So I'm super glad that, it resonated with you and that I was able to express it in a way that you can say, all right, I get it, that, we've gone from specifying knowledge in expert systems to having a machine learn it, and then, having a machine perceive the world, which is what deep learning was about, and then go on to this general intelligence where it seems to know something about everything, right? And that's kind of, that's its evolution in a nutshell, right? And I've lived through it. And so I sort of just describe it as authentically as I can. I'd hired a professional agent to read the book, and he told me, he said, I like the fact that it's balanced, and it sort of ends on this note that's both positive and concerning. And that's exactly what I want, right? I want people to embrace it, to embrace the AI, because it can do amazing things for you and it can amplify you.
But not blindly.
But not blindly, exactly, right? And so I want the reader to think about how they will fall into that first camp of, becoming superhuman and amplifying their capabilities, as opposed to falling by the wayside. That's my objective.
I think we may be coming to our close here. There are some things about AI's capabilities we definitely didn't get into. Who knows, maybe there will be a part 2. I am open to all possibilities.
I would be totally open to a part 2. Yeah, we have gone for an hour and 25 minutes.
Yeah,
so
all right.
Where did time go?
But I want to close with your close, if I may, and then I want to say something about it. Your close is from the great writer Arthur C. Clarke, and I'm going to read it. He says, present-day electronic brains are complete morons. But this will not be true in another generation. They will start to think, and eventually they will completely outthink their makers. Is this depressing? I don't think it should be. We superseded the Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal man, and we presumably are an improvement. I think we should regard it as a privilege to be stepping stones to higher things. End quote. A couple of final thoughts, if I may, my friend. I'm going to tell you something that I promise you've never heard. Are you seated?
Go for it.
I'm very dear friends with a man named Luis Elizondo, who ran a secret office at the Pentagon exploring UFOs. You may have heard of him. There was a whole series about him on Netflix. Full disclosure, he's a dear friend of mine, so I'm not objective, okay?
Yep.
It may shock you, and it may stun our listeners to know that even though the Pentagon had a budget for exploring UFOs, which they should have had, because pilots were seeing them, military pilots, commercial pilots, civil aviation pilots, radar operators, air traffic controllers, people were seeing things. But do you know what the biggest pushback was that he got at the Pentagon? This is the part that I think will shock people.
What was that?
It was from religious Christians. And their problem was, wait a minute, are you positing that there is a being smarter than us? We're not talking about God, who's clearly smarter than us. But our belief is that next to God, we are the smartest beings. And they just were not prepared to consider things in the way that Arthur C. Clarke does here, where he says, I don't think it's so depressing. We succeeded, Cro-Magnon man. We're an improvement, presumably. It's a privilege to be a stepping stone to higher things. Not everybody agrees, do they, Vasant?
No, they don't. Maybe this is my Hindu background.
I knew you were going to say it. I knew it.
Helps.
You're going to end up on an optimistic note, aren't you? Because of your Hindu background, there is nothing worse than a polytheistic Pollyanna, I tell you.
Yeah, I think you read my mind there, Jules. You were like one step ahead of me. Yeah. Hinduism, God exists in everything, and that's really how simple it is, right? It isn't about this all-powerful, person up in the sky or anything like that. I think Hinduism, acknowledges that it doesn't have any evidence, to believe such a thing, and that it prefers to let, you find your own path, that you sort of find your own way, you find your own path. It encourages you to seek enlightenment and find your own path, which I've always found to be very attractive, but it doesn't provide sort of that, tremendous clarity that other, monotheistic religions have, that essentially tell you this is God and God said, you shouldn't do these 10 things and you should do those 10 things, or you should, pray in this manner or anything like that. Hindu is completely devoid of any such structure, which is good and bad. I mean, as a kid, it's a little confusing, right? Because you have no idea what religion is really all about, and it sort of gradually dawns on you that there isn't this one thing that everyone believes in, right? Because there's no evidence to support it.
And yet you can be a devout Hindu, right?
You can, right? With the knowledge that we just don't know, right? We just know so little, about God, and that, this assumption that God just, is in all things is a simple kind of, guiding principle to follow. Yeah. So, I don't know whether I've answered the question exactly.
Actually, what I love about it is I found your book balanced. On the one hand, it is enthusiastic about the capabilities of AI. On the other hand, you acknowledge it needs to be contained. You are well aware of the risks. I found in your book, I'm going to use a word that comes from the Hindu tradition that I learned from you, satya. Tell us what it means.
The satya means truth, but it also means essence.
Mm-hmm. The way that you shared your truth landed in a very interesting way for me. I'll close with this. There's been a lot of speculation lately, or no, not speculation, been a lot of observation that English is the international language. For a while, people thought it might become Mandarin, but I don't think so. Do you know what I actually think is going to become the international language?
I'm curious.
I think in a year or two from now, we will not be saying to strangers, do you speak English? Or do you speak Mandarin? I think we'll be saying, do you speak prompt? And for prompting me to explore an area that I was terrified of, I have to thank you, Professor Vasant Dhar.
Thank you, Joel. I'm so happy to hear that.
God bless.